As you heard, I have spent 15 years working on the prevention of torture before moving 3 years ago to anti-trafficking action. So, if I may say it, I'm a tough cookie. You know, I'm not someone who is easily shocked, but it still doesn't stop to astound me every day what humans can inflict on other human beings, the injustice and cruelty which people can do to other people. Human trafficking is often named modern-day slavery, and indeed this is a very powerful and effective rhetoric. And yet I would like to say that it doesn't capture the whole complexity and diversity of issues which are brought under this umbrella term of human trafficking. Because unlike the old-time transatlantic slavery trade, where people were brought against their will to the Americas, in the case of modern-day human trafficking, we often have people who themselves want to migrate. And they have very good reasons sometimes to do that. They want to escape poverty, inequality, gender or racial discrimination. And it is their desire to move to a better life which is exploited by unscrupulous traffickers, smugglers. In fact, the two terms are often intertwined, and there is often in the media, of course, reporting about these phenomena, confusion about smuggling of people and human trafficking. And although in international law the boundaries have been clearly defined for now a number of years, in everyday life you can be smuggled one day and trafficking the other, victim of trafficking the other. So the two are not, there's no hard wall between the two terms. And that is why, when we talk about human trafficking, we have to engage into a much more varied dialogue about inequality, about discrimination, about empowerment. So it is not as simple as talking about, as I said, naming it just slavery. So the Council of Europe has been acting now for over 20 years in this area because it touches upon the very values on which the Council of Europe is built, the very values on which our civilizations are built. As you know, the Council of Europe is an organization which has, if I may say, three directions: standard setting, monitoring, and then cooperation. So in the area of human trafficking, action against human trafficking, we can see these three directions, one after the other. Standard setting, first of all. We have, since 2005, the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking Human Beings, which is arguably the most ambitious and developed international legal instrument in this area, placing obligations for placing strict legal obligations on states, not only to criminalize human trafficking in all its forms, but also to, and above all, to protect and assist victims. It's a convention which has very much a human angle. It places the victim at the heart of the protection system which is set up by this convention. So it is a convention which, as I said, places strict legal obligations on states in the areas of what we call the 4 Ps: protection, prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. When I talk about partnerships, I mean both nationally, between the various stakeholders, and internationally. So we have the convention. This is, as I said, the standard setting tool. It has been enforced now since 2008, and it has enjoyed a really success, I would say. It has been ratified so far by 42 countries, practically all the Council of Europe member states, except for a few which actually are big countries like Russia, and that's the big missing party at the moment. But 42 is, I think, for a convention open for signature in 2005, I think it is quite a good rate. So this is the standard setting, which, as I said, it's an instrument which we have, and it's a convention which has inspired the European Union's directive, which was adopted a few years ago. And in many ways, the two overlap, I would say. The Council of Europe Convention, of course, is applicable not only to the Council of Europe member states, but to any country around the world. And in fact, we're doing a lot of promotion of the convention, in particular now in Northern Africa, through various programs that the Council of Europe has in Tunisia, Morocco in particular. And we are also trying to promote it in Central Asia. So this is the standard setting, as I said. And then comes the monitoring. This is one of the Council of Europe's particularities and strengths, I would say, that we don't just have conventions, we also have independent, impartial monitoring mechanisms to make sure that these legal instruments do not remain a dead letter, but they are, in fact, effectively implemented. So I actually work for the monitoring mechanism of the convention. It is composed of two pillars. One of them is known by the acronym GRETA, a nice female name. And it is actually a group of 15 independent and impartial experts from the countries which are parties to the convention, who come from various walks of life, legal, medical, professional sociologists, civil society representatives. We have police officers, prosecutors, so it is really quite a mixed group of people. And their role is to evaluate each and every party to the convention periodically, because monitoring is not effective unless it is periodic. So GRETA has now almost finished the first round of evaluation of the convention, which started in 2010. We have already 26, soon 30 detailed country-by-country reports in the public domain. And there are several, 5 more evaluations underway, and 5 more that we are planning later this year, or next year. And GRETA is also going to start the second round of evaluation in the second half of this year. So in addition to this independent expert group, we have a more political pillar, which is known as the Committee of the Parties to the Convention. They are the representatives of the parties to the convention who are in Strasbourg at the level of ambassador or deputy to the permanent representative. They meet in order to, first of all, they are the people who elect GRETA members, but also they follow up on GRETA's reports. They don't have to approve GRETA's reports. GRETA's reports stand on their own feet, if you want. But they meet in order to then bring a political dimension to this independent expertise which GRETA provides. So they issue recommendations to each party to the convention, which are based on GRETA's conclusions and GRETA's reports. And in these recommendations, the Committee of the Parties requests each country to report within 2 years on what it has done to implement GRETA's recommendations. So we've just had earlier this year, actually already last year, the end of last year, the first parties that we evaluated in 2010, 2011, reporting back to the Committee of the Parties on measures that they have taken to implement the convention. So this was the monitoring tool. And then we come to cooperation. This is trying to help states to put in practice the results of the monitoring. I've just come last night from Poland, from Warsaw, where we spent the whole day yesterday. We had a roundtable meeting with all the relevant stakeholders in Poland, governmental agents, civil society, trade union, academics, international organizations. It was a very lively debate, a bit controversial at times, discussing with the Polish authorities how they are implementing GRETA's report, which was sent to them about a year ago. And we heard a lot about legal changes that they've made or they're planning to do, about their new action plan. And of course, it appeared that in some areas there is still, be it misunderstanding of what is expected from them, for example, in the area of compensation, or if there is the law on paper, civil society actors often brought examples of how the law doesn't really work in real life. The result of all this is that we are likely to start very soon a project with the Polish Ministry of the Interior with financing from the Norway grants, their major international donor, which will be helping the Polish authorities to strengthen their anti-trafficking action. And in particular, we're interested at helping them to strengthen prevention, because there's a lot of needs when it comes to prosecution, when it comes to building the capacity of legal professionals, of judges, of prosecutors. But in a way, that comes at a later stage. Prevention is where we have to start from. And just taking the example of Poland, it's interesting because it's actually a mixture of country of origin, country of transit, and country of destination. You have everything there. A few years ago, most of the victims identified were Polish nationals, exploited, say, in the UK, the Netherlands, or Nordic countries. Now, we have nearly 60% of the identified victims being foreign nationals, from Belarus, from Ukraine, from Central Asia. So it is a very dynamic phenomenon with a lot of trends which need to be researched, need to be properly understood. And that's why prevention is so crucial. So when we're talking about prevention, we don't want just to see awareness raising in its traditional form. Obviously, that's very powerful when you see films, when you see TV spots. These are tools which are used a lot. We want to see prevention which is actually mainstreamed through education at schools, because prevention is also about how boys and girls at school think about gender issues, about issues of ethnicity, of race. So we want to see this mainstreamed through general programs against inequality and against discrimination. We also want to see much more happening to address the demand side of trafficking. And this is an issue which is seen from different perspectives. You are probably aware about various models which exist, in particular the so-called Swedish model, which is based on criminalization of the clients of sexual services. And that's one model which is adopted by some countries. When we talk about discouraging demand, of course, it is much more than punishing clients of prostitutes. It is demand which is generated by, in a way, all of us consumers. It's consumer demand as well for cheap goods. It's demand which is linked to businesses. It is discouraging demand is also the responsibility of states to see what is happening within business corporations, the supply chain, public procurement. So it is much more than simply criminalizing clients of sexual services. So we want to really see that happening. There are provisions in the Council of Europe Convention specifically on demand. They don't spell out what states should do, but there is an obligation for states to take a whole range of legal, administrative, educational, cultural, and other measures to discourage demand. So this was to give you an example of how we are building the cooperation with our member states in order to make sure that we cross the bridge from the standard through monitoring to implementation via cooperation. Now, GRETA, as I said, is a new body. It has only been in existence for 5 years. So it, compared to other Council of Europe monitoring bodies, in particular the Committee for the Prevention of Torture that I'm well aware of, it is still building up its potential. I think the second evaluation round will be a litmus test for its efficiency, because when we start later this year going back to see what countries have done, what the impact of measures is, then you actually will see whether there is, how big the gap is between the rhetoric and the reality. I don't know whether I have more time because I think we started later, so yeah. So I wanted to say a few things. I wanted to refer you, because I saw that later today you have judges, I think, speaking to you. I wanted to refer you to a very important, groundbreaking judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, which dates back to 2010. It is the judgment, the case of Rancev against Cyprus and Russia. And it is an important case because obviously human trafficking is committed by private individuals or legal entities. And yet it is something which implies responsibility, an obligation of states, a legal obligation for states. So in this judgment that I refer to, the Rancev judgment, it's for the first time the European Court of Human Rights concluded that trafficking falls within the scope of Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights. It is the article which prohibits slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labor. And the court concluded in this case that there is a positive obligation on states to protect victims and also potential victims. And also there is a procedural obligation to investigate trafficking. It's an interesting judgment because it is the case of a young Russian woman who in the early 2000s arrived in Cyprus on what it was known at the time artiste visas in order to work in a club. And it was actually a pretext to bring her to Cyprus. And when she tried to escape, she ended up being locked in an apartment, and then the next morning she was found lying dead at the foot of the building. And there was a failure to actually investigate her death. First of all, there was a failure to protect her because when she escaped, she went to the police station. And the police officers basically returned her to the man who was running the club, who came to look for her. And as I said, she was found dead the next day. So it's an important judgment, as I said, because it affirmed this obligation, positive obligation of states to put in place all sorts of measures to prevent human trafficking, because the separate legislation at the time was certainly not protecting victims. The artiste visas, by the way, were a tool for trafficking people into the country, and they were subsequently abolished. And as I said, the obligation to investigate and also to engage in international cooperation, because it was a case between Russia and Cyprus. And there was a failure also to cooperate between the two countries, and that also involves Russia in the judgment. As I said, the convention is what we always say that it's value added compared to what we had earlier, which is at the level of the United Nations, the Palermo Protocol. The Council of Europe Convention really stresses this victim-centered, human rights-based approach. From the preamble of the convention, throughout its provisions, you see that it is a convention which puts the victim at the center, and it gives a lot of rights to victim. The right to be identified, to be given emergency assistance, to be given a recovery and reflection period of at least 30 days, to be provided with assistance even if the victim does not cooperate in the investigation. That's important because not all victims are in a position to act as witnesses, either because emotionally they're not prepared or will never be, or because they don't even know who the traffickers are. So they're not just a tool for a successful police investigation. And this is a point made throughout the convention, that there's, for example, a provision that states should put in place residence permits for victims, not only when they cooperate in the investigation and prosecution, but also for personal reasons, when their personal protection requires them to remain in the country. As I said earlier, GRETA, throughout its monitoring and evaluations, is, first of all, checking what is happening in each country, and then trying to influence decision-making, the political process in each country, to change the law and to change the practice. We have very strong partners in the face of parliamentarians in many countries. Civil society and academics are very important as well. As I said, one of the pillars of this approach, the 4P approach, is partnerships. And the Convention has a provision which talks about the need to establish strategic partnerships between the state authorities and non-state actors. And GRETA interprets this strategic partnership phrase in a very broad way. It is partnership not only to use non-governmental organization to provide support to victims, but also to involve civil society in the planning of national programs, in their implementation and in their evaluation. Because what we see very often is that you have a nice national action plan, you have a ministry implementing it, and then the next plan and the next plan, and you don't see always what the impact of the measures are. So in its reports, GRETA has always insisted on the fact that there has to be an assessment and independent assessment of the impact. We see countries where this is done by universities or specialized research centers, and it is also a way for governments to measure the temperature and to see whether they're going in the right direction. I'm often asked, what are the figures about human trafficking? Because we hear all sorts of figures, and the problem is that it is unmeasured and unmeasurable, as it is obviously a very hidden phenomenon. We have, for example, estimates by the International Labor Exploitation, according to whom almost 22 million people around the world are victims of forced labor. I mean, forced labor and human trafficking do not overlap, but human trafficking is, almost all forms of human trafficking are also encompassed in the ILO definition of forced labor. Recently, I saw figures by the US, the Department of State, talking about 27 million. So these are estimates. When we actually look at people who are identified, we're talking about thousands, not millions. In Europe, for example, the Eurostat, the European Union statistics, for 2010, the number of identified victims reported by countries were around 9,000-10,000. So there's a big gap between what we estimate to be victims of exploitation, extreme forms of exploitation, and the people who actually surface, who are identified. And then there's an even bigger gap between the number of traffickers who are successfully punished. There we're talking about dozens of cases. So we're talking millions, thousands, and then in each country we have a handful of cases. So there's a lot to be done. There is a lot to be done not just by states as such, but by all of us, because it is not just a legal obligation to act, it's a moral obligation. I very much like what is happening in the Netherlands, because they have something called the barrier model, where at every stage, local level, municipal, regional, everyone has a role to play. You know, everyone is involved in a sort of network of barriers to traffickers. It's an interesting model which I mean, I can tell you more about it if you're interested, but I think that is really an example of how it sort of brings the responsibility of all of us. I was told recently by students at the seminar I spoke at in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in a little village There was a man from another community, another ethnic community, who was working as a servant, almost a slave, a form of domestic servitude. And everyone in the village knew that, but no one did anything because he was a stranger. And that's the danger of human trafficking, that we don't see our brothers, sisters, and children sometimes. You see the stranger, and basically it's inaction, it's immobility. And it's the stranger based on ethnic or racial or other discrimination. In particular in Europe, it is often the case with the Roma communities. So I will stop at this. As I said, it's a rather bleak topic, but it is something which, in a way, motivates us, or motivates me as well, to act. Thank you.